Trial resumed. Jury not present.
The court said, "Good morning."
Ms. Shrofa said, "Good morning, Your Honor."
Mr. Horton said, "Good morning, Your Honor."
The court said, "Would you make your appearances, please?"
Mr. Horton said, "Good morning, Your Honor. Justin Horton, for the government. I'll be joined shortly by AUSAs Murray and Finkel."
Ms. Shrofa said, "Good morning, Your Honor. On behalf of Mr. Gua, standing to my left, Sabrina Shroff. Start?"
The court said, "Please be seated. Is there anything that you want to bring up before we?"
Mr. Horton said, "Just a brief timing matter, Your Honor. The government would ask for 15 minutes, 10 minutes. Between the conclusion of the defense summation so we can set up and move things around for the rebuttal."
The court said, "And how long do you think the rebuttal will take?"
Mr. Horton said, "I think an hour."
The court said, "Okay. Anything from Ms. Shroff?"
Ms. Shrofa said, "Your Honor, I was told by my client that there was some incident at the jail yesterday. I haven't gotten to the bottom of it. If there is an issue, I'll raise it and ask the court for a second appearance. If need be. I don't know what it is."
The court said, "All right. Well, if you need me before 9:30, I'm here."
Ms. Shrofa said, "Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate it. It may not, but I just don't know. Thank you."
The court said, "Okay."
Recess.
The court said, "Please have the jurors brought in."
Jury present.
The court said, "Please be seated. Good morning, jurors."
The jury said, "Good morning."
The court said, "We're now going to continue with the summation on behalf of Mr. Gua by Mr. Siddhartha Kamraju."
Mr. Kamraju said, "Thank you, Your Honor. May I proceed?"
The court said, "You may."
Mr. Kamraju said, "Thank you. Good morning. Welcome back. So when we left off yesterday, we were talking about G clubs. We just started. Now, G clubs feels like the piece of the case that the government spent the most time on at trial. You know, the cars and the campers and the mansion. All kinds of things that you might expect at a luxury membership club. So the first thing I'm going to ask you to consider at just a fundamental level is that all of those things, the cars, the house, the bikes, none of it actually matters. And why is that? Because I asked you to look through every single inch of that Shamal Medrano chart. I think Mr. Finkel said it was over 200 pages long. Look at every one. And you will not see a single promise or representation by G clubs or Mr. Gua about how the company would spend the money that it took in from the sale of memberships. Not a single one. And that makes sense, right? Because think about what Mr. Reyes thought G clubs was. It was a company that offered benefits and services to its members, right? You can see that, right? In the membership brochures. You get discounts at hotels and travel agencies, conferences like G Talks. Oh. And you remember Mr. Finkel said that the G Talk sweepstakes were rigged or staged because Mr. Gua's immigration lawyer won a car. Remember that during summation? Well, Ms. Reyes told you that she hired a third-party company to run the sweepstakes. Mr. Gua wasn't involved in that. So what was the rigging? But benefits. That's what G clubs offered its members in exchange for their membership payments. And those membership payments make up the company's revenue, the company's money. Think about it. It's no different than Netflix or Hulu or any other streaming service. You pay them $9.99 or whatever a month. For the ability to stream movies and shows or whatever, right? And after you pay that $9.99, it's gone. It belongs to the company now. And the people who run Hulu or Netflix, they can do what they want with it, right? So if the owner of Hulu wants to spend money from the company on a new car or a vacation or even a gift to someone else, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not the member's business. That's not your business if you're a Hulu member. In fact, you heard about that in this case from Ms. Reyes. It was the same for G clubs, just like for her new business. The owner of the business gets to decide how to spend the money. And ultimately, who is the owner of G Clubs? Haren he. You heard witness after witness say that. You saw document after document say that. He was the owner of G Clubs. And as you also saw, he approved every one of those purchases that the government is focused on here, the cars, the yachts, the transfers to Hamilton, the campers, all of it. So what's the issue here? The government wants you to believe that Mr. He is just a front. And that the real owners of G Clubs are either Milesun Gua or Mr. Gua himself. So let's start with Milesun. The government's entire case that he owned G Clubs comes down to some strange reference in one of those Khaled recordings where Milesun says that he's a settler of some Dutch trust. Did they give you any evidence as to what it means to be a settler of a trust, let alone a Dutch trust? Did they explain that term to you? How much significance can you give that term, when in the same call? Milesun also says, but Mr. He is the owner. And frankly, even if Milesun Gua does have some ownership interest in G Clubs, so what? Why would that fact change the basic principle that the owner of the business can use the money to buy what he wants? Right? Now let's look at the government's proof that Mr. Gua controlled G Clubs. What is that? Well, there's the testimony from Mr. Khaled, or the government asked him whether it was true that Mr. Gua did not have decisive control over G Clubs. And he said no, that wasn't true. You remember his testimony. But did Mr. Khaled actually give you any examples of what decisive control means, of what Mr. Gua's control meant? Anything other than his say-so? And we'll talk about his credibility in a second, as well. But before that, remember, he didn't even really work at G Clubs. How would he know what was happening at the company? But when you look at the testimony of somebody who actually worked at G Clubs, Limari Reyes, who was the CEO, what did she tell you? She told you that she never took any direction from Mr. Gua at all. She viewed him as a spokesperson, as a trendsetter. That's it. Now, you can imagine what Ms. Murray is going to say when I sit down. No, Mr. Reyes may not have interacted with Mr. Gua. But she interacted with Ms. Wang, who, according to them, is Mr. Gua's lieutenant. But again, look at what Ms. Reyes said. When asked by Mr. Finkel on direct who Ms. Wang reported to, what Ms. Reyes said. She said Mr. He, not Mr. Gua. For all the control that Mr. Gua is supposed to have over Mr. Wang in G Clubs, the CEO of the company didn't even think of Mr. Gua as Ms. Wang's boss, let alone G Clubs' owner. And think, in particular, about one decision that G Clubs made, the posting of that disclaimer, right? Mr. Finkel talked about it. And he told you that Mr. Gua put that disclaimer in part as part of the scheme. I think his words were he put that document in place. But it doesn't make sense. So let's read the disclaimer. What does it say? It says, basically, take what Mr. Gua says with a grain of salt, right? You're not going to get any stock, you're not making investments. According to the government, all those statements would undercut Mr. Gua's goal of tricking people into buying G Club memberships, right? But according to Mr. Finkel and the government, Mr. Gua put that in as a cover story. There's one problem with that. You heard Ms. Reyes's testimony. She didn't even consult. Sorry. Excuse me. Sorry. I have the wrong one. Well, we'll find it. But Ms. Reyes told you that she didn't even consult with Mr. Gua to put it in. She didn't even consult. It was her and the marketing team. That's what Ms. Reyes told you. Sorry, I got ahead of my slides. There it is. Were you responsible for any of the content that Mr. Finkel asked you about yesterday? The marketing team and I, yes. Okay. And you did that totally independent of Mr. Gua, right? We did not ask him. So think about it. Mr. Gua is the one who put this in place, but the marketing team and Ms. Reyes didn't even discuss it with him? And think about this, does it make any sense that if Ms. Reyes actually thought of Mr. Gua as her boss or as this implacable figure at G Clubs that you had to please? Would it make any sense that they would have put up this disclaimer without his approval, without asking him? Think about your own job. Would you put something up on your job's website that basically says, "Hey, feel free to ignore whatever my boss says"? Would you do that without even checking with your boss? No. Why? Because you'd get fired, right? The reason why they did this without Mr. Gua is because they didn't need Mr. Gua's approval to do it. Because Mr. Gua does not control G Clubs. It's that simple. So what's left? There are those recorded phone calls. Right, the ones that Mr. Khaled recorded without telling anyone. Now, the government says that the fact that Mr. Gua is on those calls is evidence that he's controlling G Clubs. So I want you to take a look at those calls again and think about the context. There's all this money flowing in. Right, from G Clubs members. It's stuck. There are complaints. And so the people who knew Mr. Khaled. The ones who had had a prior relationship with him, the ones, frankly, who had brought him in. They tried to talk to him and present options for getting the money unstuck. Okay. Send it back to the G Clubs account, right? Let's try that. Well. Can't do that because we don't have a G Clubs account. All right. How about this? How about we send it back to the people who sent it? Mr. Gua, the person with the intent to steal. According to the government says, let's give it back. But again, who shot that down? Mr. Khaled. Okay. We can't do that, how about you send it to Hamilton? Again, Mr. Khaled turned it down. Because the only thing he would accept is an agreement that kept the money with him so that he could keep making money off of it. Money that maybe he could use to buy a few more heirlooms, if you remember. And real quickly. You want to know how you know that Mr. Khaled lied to you from that stand? Well. After he got the agreement that he wanted, he still didn't do the job right, and G Clubs tried to fire him, right? Well, he sat there at that stand and told you, under oath, that after G Clubs tried to fire him, Mr. Khaled didn't even want to stay in the contract with G Clubs. He said that in July of 2021. He wanted to be done with the company. So if that's true, then why were his lawyers, at Mr. Khaled's direction, begging G Clubs to stay? This is the letter that his lawyer sent to G Clubs. We propose that G Clubs withdraw the notice of termination. Does this sound like Mr. Khaled is trying to get out of the deal? Of course not, because he lied to you. Because Mr. Khaled, the man who lied to banks, who lied on his mortgage applications, on his taxes, sat there and lied to you. So let's go back to the recorded calls. The money stuck and there was nothing they could do to shake it loose. And then you had that one call. The one with all the screaming, right? Remember Mr. Finkel opened his presentation with it. So let's talk about that call. Because while the government wants you to believe that they show Mr. Gua's control of G Clubs, in fact, they do the exact opposite. So first off, if you think that Mr. Gua is as big and bad as the government would tell you, then why were there so many phone calls in the first place? Mr. Khaled told you he was afraid of Mr. Gua. So if he is afraid of Mr. Gua, then you would think that one phone call from Mr. Gua, and this would be settled. It's all a scam, right? They can do whatever they want. So why is it when the boss, when the principal calls, it's over? They played recording after recording for you where nothing got done, even though Mr. Gua was angry. Even though Mr. Gua was yelling and screaming. And nothing got done. And look at the way those calls went. Just go back and look at the transcript. Everyone is explaining stuff to Mr. Gua. They are not giving in to him. No one is backing down to him. No one says, okay, Mr. Gua, whatever you want. They tell him no repeatedly. No. You can't do that. We can't do it that way. I know you want to do this, I know you want to do that. But we can't do it. Over and over again they tell him no. Is that the head of a racketeering enterprise? Is that the person who runs this massive fraud, the guy who keeps getting told no over and over again? And then yes. He loses his cool. But look at what happened before he loses his cool. Ms. Wang and Mr. Je say, look. We got to go to the board. We got to do this the right way. We got to go to Harenhe. And if you look at the call. Mr. Gua says okay. Even during all the screaming, all the yelling, he never says, screw you, you scumbag. We're not going to the board. You shameless bastard, how dare you propose that we go to the board? He doesn't say any of that. All he does is he gets angry. Okay. I think we all know that we get angry sometimes. But Mr. Gua does not direct them to change anything. And ultimately, Mr. Je and Ms. Wang do it exactly the way they want. They get the sign-off from Limari Reyes and Mr. He. And you see that in the government's own exhibits. So if those calls show anything, they show Mr. Gua's lack of control of these people, not the other way around. And I know the government says, well. Okay, but why was he on these calls in the first place? He's a spokesperson. Well, let's talk about that. There's no doubt that Mr. Gua was a celebrity figure in the movement, and so in the G Club's member community as well. He was a spokesperson for the company. And just a quick note on that. Mr. Finkel commented on how, Mr. Gua is a spokesperson, but his contract didn't provide for any compensation. So think about that for a second. Mr. Gua is a fraudster, according to the government, the company is huge sham, right? There's millions of dollars there. Why not take a salary? According to them, you're broke. Think about how much money celebrity endorsers can make. So why not just take a few $1,000,000 as a salary? No one would have thought twice about it. It would have been easy to explain. He didn't do that. And the reason why he didn't do that is because Mr. Gua didn't care about the money, he cared about the movement. And that's why he was on those calls. Yes, we said in our opening statement that Mr. Gua was the movement. And the movement is him. And that's because it's true. And he was putting his name on the line for the movement while fending off the CCP's attempts to kill it in its infancy. So every misstep was a potential disaster for the movement. And G Clubs, which catered to the movement members, was supposed to help form the movement's social fabric, had a problem. So yes, Mr. Gua is on those calls. But that's because he was concerned about the impact on the movement and the dampening of the members' enthusiasm. He even says that in the calls. It wasn't money at stake, it was his life's work at risk. And if you had gone through everything Mr. Gua had gone through to bring the movement to that point, wouldn't you be involved? Wouldn't you want to make sure that things were going right? Wouldn't you want to make sure it was being pushed forward? Or would you just sit back and let someone like Mr. Khaled hold on to all of that money that did not belong to him? So why does this issue of control matter in the end? It matters because without it, the government has no way to connect Mr. Gua to what they said went wrong at G Clubs. They have no evidence that he controlled any aspect of the company's business. They called one G Club's employee at this trial, Ms. Reyes. And she told you she barely interacted with Mr. Gua and she didn't think of him as her boss. That was all Mr. He. And what's the government's only connection between Mr. Gua and Mr. He? What is it? Well, you remember Judge Torres in her instructions told you that just because you're friends with a criminal doesn't make you a criminal. Well, here, the government is saying that Mr. Gua is on the hook for actions of not even his friend, but his son's friend. And they are doing that without showing you a single communication between Mr. Guo and Mr. He. Or even a single communication between Milesun and Mr. He about G clubs. So how do they tie any of those acts? The Fiesta acts, the Ferrari, how do they tie any of those to this man, who's sitting in New York? Who has never had a single conversation with them about it? Because, trust me, if that evidence existed, don't you think they would put it in front of you? So what did they try to connect to him? The Lamborghinis and the mansions. Well, based on the paperwork and the government's witnesses, the most logical conclusion for both of those are their G Club's member benefits, not Mr. Guo's property. You remember Mr. Finkel asked Ms. Reyes about the G Club's website and how the company didn't offer those curated life experiences. Go back and look at that testimony. What did she actually say? She acknowledged the company didn't offer those experiences at the time. But she also said that they were working on it. And that's what you saw during her testimony. That G Clubs was trying to acquire benefits for its members also. And think about what was going on in the fall of 2020. The world was still in the grip of COVID, right? And as you heard Ms. Reyes testify, that made it hard to offer the full spectrum of benefits that you might anticipate at a luxury membership club, fancy restaurants, travel, hotels, experiences. All of that is nearly impossible with COVID. So yes, there weren't a lot of options for a luxury membership club trying to get off the ground. There's only so much you could offer your members at that time. But the company did what it could. It offered a significant discount on G Fashion. And that's a brand that you or I may not buy. But one that had special resonance with G Clubs' target audience. In fact, you saw how much money Mr. Zhou and Mr. Dai spent on it and saved on their G Fashion wear. Mr. Zhou came in here to tell you how he thought the clothing was poorly crafted or average. And even after he said he concluded that, he still spent thousands of dollars on it. Because he cared about the brand. Apparently, G Clubs offered a remote conference, G Talks, for members to hear from speakers of interest. And remember, that was the one with the do not say list, the do not say words list. I'm not exactly sure what the importance of that list is, because as you saw in those videos, Mr. Guo does have a way of going on when he speaks. And a reminder that maybe talking about prosecutors or the SEC wouldn't be the best idea while prosecutors and the SEC are investigating. And just a note on that. You may have missed it, but this is on the do not say list, voice of Guo, voice of good. So for all of that talk about how every G that you've heard about in this case is Mr. Guo's name, apparently, voice of good was used enough that they had to put it on this list. Think about that. This is a list that they say is supposed to go to Mr. Guo for words that he's not supposed to say. Things that they are worried that he might say. So they're worried he's going to talk about something called voice of good. You know why you're worried about it? Because you've used that term before. Because people have used that term before. So I know they mocked our witnesses and they said, oh, you're telling us that G isn't Guo. They're telling you that. Not just us. And there was one more thing though that the company offered its members right from the beginning. Ms. Reyes testified about it. The members felt like they were part of a community, right? They were bound by this common membership, a common outlook, for many of them even a common goal. And that's not about whether the G Clubs is formally a part of the NFSC or not. You cannot deny that the group had overlapping memberships. Wealthy Chinese people who had left China and were looking for an opportunity to bring about political change in their home country. And uniting together, that matters. Maybe not in ways that make sense to you and me, who don't have that same background, but still not in ways that are unusual or unfamiliar to us. We all value things for different reasons, right? Maybe you brave them as you're buying Mets tickets every year. Over and over again, because they are your grandfather's team. May not make sense to somebody, but you do it. Or maybe you pay for a museum membership because you feel linked to history that way. It may not hit the same for others, but it does for you. Or maybe you're active in politics because you feel good contributing to that cause, even though other people can't stand it. Many of us spend money on things that may not make sense to others for reasons that others don't have. But in the words of that old MasterCard commercial, the way it makes us feel, that's priceless. And so think about what happened in 2021. After the company had started working out its banking issues. You heard from Ms. Reyes, she started looking for different opportunities, right? She traveled to Europe to see if there are things that they could offer their members. And you saw those contracts that G clubs entered into for yachting opportunities and hotel stays. And you heard how Ms. Reyes scored that Formula I race opportunity. That would be a pretty cool trip if you could do it, right? And you also heard from Ms. Reyes that the company was buying luxury vehicles for its members to use. So in 2021, what did you see? Well, you saw that the company had bought a Lamborghini, right? This one. The one with the scissor doors. And you heard Ms. Reyes say that the car was supposed to be for G Club's members. After all, it was bought in G Club's name. And it was intended to be leased to G Club's members so that they could enjoy the thrill of driving it. So to sum it up, you have the CEO of G Club saying that the car was bought for G Club's members. Then you have the records from the dealership saying that the car was bought for G Clubs. So what is the argument? Why does the government say no, this was Mr. Gua's cars? For two reasons. Basically, the first is that on the day of Mr. Gua's arrest, March 15, 2023. The car was in Mr. Gua's garage in his home in Connecticut. And Mr. Finkel called that devastating evidence. Well, let's take a look at it. I think the best way to do it is to go through a chronology. So the car is bought September 13, 2021. You saw it was to be shipped to Connecticut. December 10, 2021. There's a video posted, the H-Coin to the Moon, that has a clip of Mr. Gua driving the car. Drives it about 10 feet near what it looks like his Connecticut home. And then sometime in 2022. Ms. Reyes testifies that she sees Mr. Gua showcase, that's her word, the Lamborghini in a video for G Clubs. And then on March 15, you have the FBI raid. That's the government's evidence right there. That's what they gave you. They have no evidence of Mr. Gua actually ever using the car other than for a prop on behalf of the Himalaya Exchange or G Clubs. No evidence of him joyriding in it, no taking it around the track in Italy. No witness testimony about him bragging about his new car. No evidence at all about where the car was even at during these periods. Where was the car between December 10, 2021 and sometime in 2022? Can they tell you? No. They have no idea. Where was the car in late 2022, when it was used for G Clubs and March 15, 2023? Do they know? They can't tell you. They gave you no evidence of it. Think about it. If that video was filmed in December of 2022, that car might have just been sitting there for a couple of months during the winter. Remember there was that battery charger at the Lamborghini witness testified about. So basically, at this point what the government has given you is that over a 2-year span, at most, 3 times that car was in Mr. Gua's home. And 2 of those times are tied to the filming of a promotional video for G Clubs, the company that owned it. And one of its corporate partners, the Himalaya Exchange. And the 3rd time. You have no idea when the car got there or how the car got there. But it's unlikely that it was there for Mr. Gua's personal benefit because there's no evidence that he drives. Even in the video you saw, he drove like 10 feet and he looked terrified. So ask yourself. Can you really tell what happened here based on the case the government has given you? Can you confidently say that Mr. Gua is right and that he stole money to buy this car that he parked in this house? No, you can't. Because it's at least as likely that Mr. Gua, a spokesperson for G Clubs, used the Lamborghini on a couple of occasions to promote the company and one of its corporate partners. Basically just like all those yachts and jets that you saw in the other videos. And that's especially true given how many people at G Clubs knew of the purchase of the Lamborghini. I mean, what was Mr. Gua going to do, steal it from under all of their noses? What happens if somebody from G Clubs called up and said, hey, one of the members wants to drive it? Where is it? What were they going to say? And that's especially true when you think about Ms. Reyes's testimony about the Lamborghini. Here it is. Please revisit it when you're deliberating. Because it really kind of sums up why the government's case on this doesn't make sense. So during cross-examination, Ms. Reyes testified that she saw the Lamborghini video in 2022, and it was a video in which Mr. Guo was promoting G Clubs. She couldn't remember one. But you remember it was a bit of a funny moment during testimony. She corrected me. I said he was driving the vehicle, and she said, no, he was showcasing it. Now, the notable thing is that she said that when she saw him showcasing the Lamborghini, she wasn't concerned about, oh, no, Mr. Gua has stolen the car, why does he have it? Her concern was that he's promoting it as a benefit to G Club's members when the car wasn't available yet. So think about that. Ms. Reyes, the CEO of G Clubs, didn't freak out because she saw the car in Mr. Gua's Connecticut home. That didn't bother her because she knew that that was part of Mr. Gua's job as a spokesperson for the company. What bothered her was he was telling members about it before it was ready. The government's own witness, Ms. Reyes, offers you the most credible evidence on why Mr. Gua had that car at his home. And that evidence supports Mr. Gua's version of events, not the government's. Now, Ms. Reyes's testimony also explains the government's other big evidence. You heard Mr. Finkel talk about it. The fact that the name on the paperwork related to the car was found in the Connecticut home. And it was in the name of Chow Defeng, Wayne, Mr. Gua's daughter's boyfriend. But you also heard an explanation of that from both Ms. Reyes and Scott Barnett. Remember what Ms. Reyes told you? After they bought those cars there was some issue with insuring them, right? Now, there is no evidence anywhere that Mr. Guo was involved in any of these insurance issues. This was a G Club's issue that they were trying to resolve to get these cars to the members. And you even heard that G Clubs hired a firm to do that in 2022. And what was the nature of that firm? A firm to work with future benefits of renting for members, yes. But it wasn't working. So now think about what Mr. Barnett told you. Remember him, the former NYPD detective. Now turned head of Mr. Gua's security team at the time, one of Ms. Maestrello's handymen, I guess. Well, he told you that there were G Club's motorcycles in his name that Yvette Wong was going to rent out to members. The same with the Lamborghini. And that was because Mr. Barnett had a license. Nothing nefarious. Nothing about holding it for Mr. Gua. But he had a license. But Barnett got spooked at the prospect of members leasing out or renting out the car, or the motorcycle, excuse me. Why? Not because he thought it was illegal. He didn't want somebody to crash a $40,000 motorcycle into a lamppost and make it his fault. And you heard that the Lambo was the same. Mr. Barnett understood that they were going to rent that out to members as well. So now you've heard both from Ms. Reyes, a government witness, and Mr. Barnett, a defense witness, the same thing, that they were going to rent this car out. That they were going to rent these motorcycles out, even though they were in Mr. Barnett's name. So why do you think it would be any different with Mr. Defeng? They put the names in people they trust. And do you think Mr. Barnett, a longtime NYPD officer, would sign on for it if he thought it was criminal? He's not a member of Mr. Gua's family. He's not a supporter. So why would he do it? So that's the cars and the motorcycles and the campers. All the other evidence is much less compelling. The Bugatti. What did they show you? They showed you that the name on the paperwork was originally Mile Sun Gua. Ms. Reyes explained that. She told you that Mile Sun Gua had an in with Bugatti, so he introduced it. So his name ended up on the paper. And then she fixed it. It was a typo. What about the Ferrari? Well, Mile Sun Gua is clearly a pretty well-connected Ferrari driver. So the evidence is he helped his friend pick out a Ferrari, and that he test drove it once. Or where Mr. Finkel told you whether all these things were paid for by loans and there was no loan repayments. Well, look at the bank records. Take a look at money coming back from G Clubs International Limited. Back to the Puerto Rico entity in 2022, when the loans would be repaid. Look, there's a withdrawal for almost $5 million. So think about that. Have they shown you the whole story? So what does that bring us to? That brings us to the Crocker Mansion, Darlington. The place that the government claims G Clubs bought to be Mr. Gua's New Jersey estate. So here's what's undisputed. Right. After a considerable struggle with Mr. Khaled at Crane, what happens? Mr. J.E. suggests that because there's nowhere else for the money to go, it should be transferred to the hedge fund Hamilton, right? Now, that wasn't Mr. Gua's instruction. That came from Mr. J.E. Mr. Gua said, send it back. But in the end, you heard Mr. Khaled refused to do that. So the only viable solution was sending it to Hamilton, which was approved by Mr. He, by the way. So the money is transferred to Hamilton, and Hamilton uses it to buy a property, an investment property, in New Jersey. Now, the government claims that he did that for Mr. Gua. But there's no evidence why Mr. J.E. would take this money out of his fund, where he's earning a fee on it, and use it to buy a third home in the States for Mr. Gua. And there's no evidence of why Mr. Gua would even want that. And I don't mean any offense here, I'm from a small town myself. But here's what the government would have you believe, that this Chinese billionaire, just a few years removed from living an insane life in Beijing, with access to a yacht, a private jet, hundreds of millions of dollars, that what this guy really is dreaming for is a huge house in Bergen County, New Jersey. He has an entire floor of a luxury apartment in Manhattan. And just in case that's not good enough, a home in Connecticut with tennis courts. And this guy says, no, I want another place off the turnpike. That's what he wants you to believe, that they would steal all this money, this man, who could be anywhere in the world in any second, and says, let me steal this money to complete the triple crown of the tri-state luxury home circuit. It doesn't make sense. What makes sense is that Mr. J.E. bought it to be the kind of physical club that G Clubs had promised its members. A safe space. That's what makes sense. And when you think about it and when you look about it, it's consistent with the kinds of properties that Ms. Reyes was looking at in London. This is one of them. This is another. Don't they look familiar? They look a lot like Mawa. They have spas. They have all the same kind of things that Mawa has, because that's what they were looking for. So you can see that the actual place, the property, is very similar to what G Clubs was already looking for. So doesn't it make sense that the hedge fund manager managing G Clubs' money might buy a place like that? So what are they going to say? Well, Ms. Reyes didn't know about it. Well, the reason why she didn't know about it, it's because it was invested in a hedge fund. And as you saw time and time again, an investment in a hedge fund, the hedge fund manager decides what to invest in. That happened with Yield Esta and Bo Collins. And it happened with Heyman. It's no more nefarious than when it happens with Mr. J.E. So it's no shock that Ms. Reyes wasn't tracking the company's investments because she wasn't even responsible for the company's finances. Maybe they'll say, but the slide says it's in Puerto Rico, that's where it's supposed to be. There are no G Clubs members in Puerto Rico. You know where there's a lot of G Clubs members? In New York. You know what else there is? A large international airport where G Clubs members can fly in to use the club. Again. That makes sense. Okay. So why was he picking out the furniture? Why wouldn't somebody from G Clubs be doing that? What did Ms. Reyes tell you? Mr. Guo was a trendsetter for that community. G Club's members liked his taste. What did Mr. Guo do in China? You heard from Ms. Maestrello, he built luxury hotels. He built properties. He had a huge hotel called the Pangu. And what kind of designers were they looking for? You saw this in the text. So if you're trying to decorate a luxury clubhouse for people who have similar taste to Mr. Guo, then doesn't it make sense for Mr. Guo, the company spokesperson and resident luxury hotel designer, to weigh in on the design? And I know they showed you all those things about mattresses and toilets and all those different invoices. Those are all things that you would have in a luxury hotel, all things you would have in a luxury clubhouse. It's the same thing. So what else does the government have? It has the testimony from Christine Frosini, the real estate agent, and those documents where it says, where Mr. Guo says the house is for his family. Or those invoices about the ladies' wing or the madam's room or Wayne's room. But I know there was a lot of emphasis placed on that. But emphasis is not evidence, ladies and gentlemen. So what does the evidence tell you? But first, it tells you that the Malwa property was part of an exclusive neighborhood. And that it was designated to be used as a home, right? Ms. Frosini told you that. On the other hand, as we've seen, Malwa looks like a pretty ideal G Club's clubhouse, right? It matches what's in the brochure and it's a great location. And G Club's members were clamoring for their benefits. Right? One hitch, do you think you could buy a place like Malwa if you say, hey there, we're looking to buy this mansion for our anti-CCP, pro-Chinese democracy social club. We're going to bring in a bunch of people from all over the world and have a ton of security. Because the Chinese government might try to kidnap our members. Do you think there's any universe in which you could buy a house like that, anywhere in the country? Of course not. So, yes, they said the Chinese billionaire was going to buy it. Because that's the only way they would ever be able to pull it off. And Mr. Finkel said that the reason why there was so much secrecy was not because of their concerns of the CCP, but because of the trustee and the bankruptcy. That doesn't make sense. Because they bought the house and put in all that secrecy before the PAC's judgment and before the bankruptcy filing. Malwa was bought in November of 2021. The PAC's judgment happened in February 2022. The bankruptcy happened in February 2022. It doesn't make sense. So that's the government's proof. Does it move the needle? I submit it doesn't. But it certainly doesn't when you heard from Mr. Barnett and Leanne Lee. And Mr. Barnett told you that he, who was the head of security, he used to take Mr. Guo there from time to time. They didn't put forth any evidence of Mr. Guo even visiting Malwa or staying in Malwa, excuse me. We gave you that. And Mr. Barnett told you why. He went to oversee the renovations, he went to broadcast. And you saw this footage of him broadcasting, right? That's what he was using the property for. But Mr. Barnett is Mr. Guo's head of security, right? His job is to make sure that Mr. Guo is safe. And as part of that, he's got to know where Mr. Guo is and where Mr. Guo is going to live. And he never understood Malwa to be Mr. Guo's place. He never understood that. In fact, he thought it was supposed to be a place for the movement members to enjoy, like those that bought G Club's memberships. And in fact, Mr. Barnett's impression was that Mr. Guo's wife hated the place and didn't want to live there. Okay. So why were there clothes in Malwa? Well, Mr. Barnett also told you that he made the call to have certain members of the family, Mr. Gua's daughter and wife, go to Malwa for a little bit in 2023 because of security concerns. So is it any wonder that they kept some clothes or cash or documents there? These are people who may very well have to flee at a moment's notice because the CCP could try to disappear them. And finally, there's Lian Li's testimony. She puts the nail in the coffin. Because what did she tell you? She tells you long before an arrest, long before there was any need to explain what Malwa was. She talked about it with Mr. Gua. And Mr. Gua told her to go find other properties for people in the movement to use. And before they bought Malwa, he asked her to put together a presentation about the property so that they could explain it to the movement members. So they could highlight and showcase what they were going to use it for. That's how you know what Mr. Guo was thinking about the property. That was before he was arrested. That was before they charged him for buying the Malwa place. So think about it. That's what you know. And against that backdrop, how can you say that the government has proven its G Club charges beyond a reasonable doubt? You cannot. So we come to the Himalaya exchange. And I'm going to try not to spend a lot of time on this. Because they didn't. Because, frankly, it has very little to do with Mr. Gua. You didn't see any evidence he owned it. You didn't see any evidence he was directing its operations. The most you saw is that some unnamed Himalaya exchange employee told Jesse Brown Mr. Gua wanted to start on a certain date. Well, I think, as you've seen over the course of this trial, Mr. Gua is very eager for things to happen for the movement. And the exchange was a critical part of that. Because it was intended to help people who feared the Chinese government move their money easily. That was the idea. And you heard from Ms. Sklar that cryptocurrencies are a prime way to deal with repressive regimes. And you heard from Mr. Doran how the Chinese government tends to confiscate property. But that's all you really heard about Mr. Gua's role at the exchange. So what does the government say he did wrong? They said he promoted it improperly. They said it's not a real cryptocurrency because there were credits and not a lot of activity on the blockchain. I'm going to submit to you that you do not have to spend a lot of time on this argument because you have testimony from Ms. Sklar, who is the only cryptocurrency expert that you heard from at this trial. And what did she tell you? She told you that the Himalaya exchange worked like a centralized cryptocurrency exchange. And you heard that a centralized cryptocurrency exchange, like well-known ones like you may know, like Coinbase. It's common not to have a lot of transactions appear in the blockchain because of the way they are set up. Instead, because of that, all of the trading is reflected on an internal company ledger. That's where you get the credits right from. There's nothing unusual about that. Basically, what the government is asking you to do is to convict Mr. Gua based on a philosophical difference in the cryptocurrency community. That is not evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And it wasn't like the exchange was hiding any of that. You saw that the exchange openly discussed in its white papers the use of credits. And they had Mr. Roberts, the investigator. What did he tell you? He just assumed that couldn't be true. But then look, sorry. He just assumed that the idea of back-to-back redemptions, the one-to-one redemptions, couldn't be true. But look at what he said on cross-examination. He said that he actually couldn't know how much HDO was in circulation. So he couldn't do it. And why was that important? Because what the exchange actually said was the one-to-one backing was for HDO in circulation. And he didn't know what was in circulation. So you can discount his testimony on that entirely. You saw that Armanino, an auditing firm, actually had access to the information that Mr. Roberts admitted he didn't have. And it concluded that, in fact, there was a one-to-one backing between the number of HDO that customers had actually bought and what dollars the exchange were holding in reserve. So, again, much ado about nothing. And then there's the gold. I think we can all acknowledge that Mr. Gua's statements on the gold may seem a little confusing. But that's not surprising. Because you heard from Mr. Brown. The folks at the exchange knew he wasn't explaining it right, but they decided not to tell him. And that's not the only time that Mr. J.E. kept information about the exchange from Mr. Gua. You remember Leanne Lee's testimony about how she traveled to London to try to get financial records because Mr. Guo was concerned about how Mr. J.E. was running the exchange. And what did Mr. J.E. do? Stonewalled her. So does that sound like Mr. Gua is controlling Mr. J.E. and the exchange? But anyway, what's the government's proof that Mr. Guo was intentionally lying about the gold? The Armanino report. Ms. Sklar's testimony, only half the story. Mr. Brown told you that there were plans to purchase gold. So you know that's not something that was made up whole cloth by Mr. Guo. And you see at the end there. Mr. Brown says he doesn't know what Sharps Pixley is, do you see that? You know who does know what Sharps Pixley is? Tom Bishop. Tom Bishop, who described to you how, in March of 2022, the Himalaya Exchange sent $5 million to Sharps Pixley, a London-based gold broker. So the exchange was making good on its gold promise, just bit by bit. And you don't spend $5 million like that if it's a fraud. Jesse Brown told you this was a real business. He told you about all the compliance. In fact, he told you he thought the company had too much compliance in place. He told you that Mr. J.E. had spent millions of his own money before any tokens were sold. And if this were all a big fraud, would you just give $70 million in redemptions to the exchange customers back if you're just trying to steal the money anyway? I mean, those are redemptions that the exchange wasn't obligated to honor. It doesn't add up. And finally, you have the loan, the $37 million loan. I don't understand what's wrong with the loan, frankly. The money came from the exchange's profits. They were open about it. It was approved by the exchange's board, including Jesse Brown. And it was filed with a U.S. court. If anybody thought they were doing something illegal with that loan, why would they be so open about it? Why would Mr. J.E. talk to Bo Collins about it? Why would they make no effort to hide it? So now there's one last so-called misrepresentation that we have to talk about. The government spent some time on this. And that's the so-called guarantee that Mr. Gua made to pay everyone back for their losses. Remember, they ended their case with that, spliced together video of Mr. Gua saying he would pay people back. So a couple of things on that. The first is, remember, even if you find that there was a misrepresentation, you have to find that it was material. That it would be expected to be of concern to a reasonable and prudent person in making their decision. And what was the government's evidence? They put some people up who said they relied on these guarantees and they thought it was no risk. Judge Torres also instructed you, however, that you have to consider the total mix of information available. And what other information was available then? Well, you saw Mr. Gua tell people in the announcement video that GTV was risky. That they should read the prospectus and understand its risk. And the prospectus included disclosures about the risk. It also told them that it was risky. And you saw that Mr. Guo was public about his bankruptcy. He made a video about it and told people about it. So all of that is part of the mix of information. And you also heard from Mr. Dragon about how he, a valuation expert, would think about the impact of the guarantee on assessing the investment opportunity. What did he tell you? He told you that he would have to consider a guarantee. But there's a number of factors that go into how you decide to weigh it. Here's what he says. So measure this up against what Mr. Gua said. And I think you'll see that Mr. Gua's statements are hardly the kind of material ironclad guarantee that the government makes them out to be. And think about this, what are the losses he's supposed to pay back? On GTV, you saw Mr. Gua's view. He thinks Soraka ate the loss. He thinks the loss came from Soraka as part of the pizza, right? So why would he pay back someone else? And how could there be any losses on the farm loans? When the loans didn't even come due until after Mr. Gua's arrest? And G clubs, how can there be a loss? People paid for those memberships. And each of the government's so-called victim witnesses failed to submit refund requests during periods set by the company. Not Mr. Gua. Mr. Gua didn't deny them those refunds. And finally, the exchange. Their witnesses bought these coins at 10 cents apiece. And is there any evidence that the price dipped below 10? So what is the loss? And here's the thing, Judge Torres instructed you that the government has to show that at the time Mr. Gua made the statement, he knew it was false. It's not enough that the statement he said later turned out to be untrue. But all the government has given you is that Mr. Gua supposedly didn't make these repayments that he was owed. They've showed you nothing about his intent at the time he made those statements. And that is not enough. So I've nearly come to the end of my time, and I just want to leave you with a few closing thoughts. As you know, when I sit down, Ms. Murray will have a chance to reply. The government has the burden, so they get the last word. But I submit, even with that advantage, they still will not be able to sustain their burden. And so what does Mr. Gua get? What helps balance the scales? Well, one thing he gets is the presumption of innocence and the reasonable doubt standard. As we discussed, from day one of this trial through right now, Mr. Gua must be presumed innocent. And he will always have that presumption of innocence unless you find that the government has proven his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And what does that mean? Judge Torres told you. It means that after you review the evidence, you must find Mr. Gua not guilty if you have the kind of doubt that would give you serious pause in acting on serious matters in your life. How serious is this? And so I just want to say something about the quality of the evidence that the prosecution has given you. Don't worry. I'm not going to go through it all again, I promised you that I was going to sit down. But just think about some of what you've seen and heard at this trial. And ask yourself whether you can actually have confidence in the government's case. They called a lot of witnesses. And Judge Torres gave you guidance on how to evaluate the credibility of witnesses. Look at how they answered questions on direct and cross-examination, right? Are they different? Do they have an incentive to favor one party or the other? And obviously, your common sense. So one class of witnesses they gave you are people who will tell you the inside story. According to them, Limari Reyes or Haitham Khaled, Jesse Braun, Yali. All people here intimately involved with what happened. The CEO of G Clubs, the CEO of the exchange. The head of banking relationships, a member of the Iron Blood Group. All people intimately involved in things that they say are frauds. Who took actions in furtherance of the things that they say are frauds. But you saw them in this courtroom at that witness stand, not the defense table. And why is that? Because the government agreed not to prosecute them. And the price for the government's mercy? That they testify. If asked by the government, and they tell the truth, they told you. What else did they tell you? That they only get to keep the deal if the government thinks they are telling the truth, right? So is it any wonder that they would say things that they think are helpful to the government? Oh. I never heard of Mawa. Miles Gua controlled G Clubs. I did nothing at the exchange. And the thing is you saw no evidence corroborating any of those things. Just the words of witnesses relying on the government for their get-out-of-jail-free card. That's it. Now. The government also called all of those so-called victims, right? Now. Ask yourself this, if someone who is close to you had a serious medical issue, and Yali or Luzhou was the doctor. How comfortable would you feel? Would their involvement give you pause? Because that's what you have to think about here. And think about the way those witnesses were on direct examination. More than happy to answer any question. And what was their answer to almost every one of those questions? Miles Guo told me to do it. I did it because of Miles Guo. Miles Guo said there was laser technology. Did you ever see that in a video? But then on cross-examination, right, just think about Yali. Just the steady string of I don't remembers, I don't know, I have no idea. Or Ms. Chen on cross-examination. How she just wouldn't answer the question. But instead took every chance she had to go out of her way to call Mr. Guo a fraud. Same with Jenny Li or Lu Zhou. Or think about Patrick Chin, who was so confused that he thought he had invested in Guo Media. Even they don't say anybody invested in Guo Media. And just think about this, each of those witnesses testified that they followed Mr. Guo blindly. Except when he told them to look at the documents that would undercut the government's case. That's the one time they didn't follow his command, according to them. Does that make sense? They did everything this man said except that. I guess, but the truth is a foreign language to those witnesses. So ask yourself, why did they testify this way? Well, Ms. Murray, I'm sure, will say they are angry. They think they've been scammed, they think they've been defrauded, they want their money back. But think about that for a second. Many of them told you they didn't wake up until they saw the government's indictment in this case. An indictment is just an allegation. And basically, these witnesses, even under the government's version, just took the government's word for it. They swallowed the government's tail hook, line, and sinker. Without hearing the evidence that you've heard. So they have an obvious bias towards the prosecution. At the bare minimum, they are looking to them to get money back. And at least one of them, Yali, told you about how the Chinese government visited her parents and told them that she needed to knock it off. To cut her association with Mr. Guo. So is it so hard to believe in a case like this that she might take that stand and testify in a way that she thinks that the CCP would approve of? To disavow Mr. Guo? Of course not.
Continued on next page.
Mr. Kumraju said, and then they gave you all those summary charts, so many charts. But no matter how many there are, their value to you is zero because they're all misleading. You remember Mr. Medrano's chart? That was the one with the Steve Bannon clip. I won't pull that back up, or Ms. Espinosa's chart. Remember that's the one where she testified about a dozen slide chart with hundreds of arrows. Only to have Mr. Skirik draw the same transaction fairly and accurately according to Ms. Espinosa on a piece of paper in 2 minutes. Or the G Club's chart witness who put up a chart of G Club's loan agreements that counted both signed loan agreements and earlier drafts. Why do that? Just to make the numbers look bigger. Or Mr. Hinton who we talked about. Remember how Brattle worked on the chart for like a year. And the prosecutors were changing it until the day before he testified. And how those boxes didn't make any logical sense. Look at those. Under Mr. Hinton's testimony. These arrows don't make any sense. Think about it. How he told you that you couldn't do the analysis necessary to tie the farm loan money to any of these payments. That's a more accurate chart. So how much faith can you have in these charts or this testimony when you see this? They also put up a lot of documents. One of the documents Mr. Finkel talked about was an unsigned trust agreement. Do you remember that, between Milesun Gua and Himalaya Exchange? And he said, well, look, it's the execution version. But it wasn't signed and it wasn't dated. So how much faith can you have in that? Can you have any idea when the document was created? Why it was created? Who created it? Whether it was an idea that was considered and rejected, whether the author had any accurate information? Of course not. You have no information about the creation of that document. And I'm sure Ms. Murray will stand up and say, well, it's all part of the cover story. Well, Mr. Ferguson asks you to use your common sense. And ask yourself this in your common sense. If it is part of the cover story, why wouldn't you sign it? why wouldn't you finalize it? What good is the document to a cover story as unsigned? It doesn't make any sense. I'm sure they'll talk about videos. When I sit down, I'm sure you will hear a lot about videos. I'm not going to go through them all. There's one that you saw during the trial that Mr. Finkel talked about that's instructive. And that's the one where Mr. Gua says that the US government will never falsely accuse you of a crime. You remember that one? They showed you that near the end of trial. Well, just in case it's not clear. Mr. Gua's opinion on that has changed. But, think about the clip for a second. It actually undercuts the government's case. Think about it. Mr. Gua made that statement during an SEC/FBI investigation into all of the stuff that you heard about. Ask yourself. Mr. Gua, the criminal mastermind with access to a yacht, a jet, and hundreds of millions of dollars in fraud proceeds according to them, just sits here in New York waiting to be arrested when he knows that people are making complaints to the SEC and the FBI. That makes no sense. Or how they show you all these scary bank account charts and say innocent people don't act like that. Only people with something to hide, asking you to ignore the obvious. The reason why Mr. Gua and his compatriots were doing any of those things was because they were being hunted by the CCP. Not the FBI. Think about the video again. He's inviting the FBI into the tent, not running away from them. But he's terrified that the CCP is chasing him, and he has good reason to be afraid, given the lengths they've gone to stop him. You know what, you heard from Mr. Doran that those steps, multiple cell phones, different bank accounts, heightened security, that's the advice that Mr. Doran gives his clients that are targets of Operation Fox Hunt. And there's the biggest Operation Fox Hunt target maybe in the world sitting right there. So that is the kind of evidence that they've given you. That is the shaky evidence that they want you to use to find this man guilty. But is that the kind of evidence you can rely on to do so? I say you can't. Every time I've done this in the past. Whenever I sit down I always remember a bunch of things I should have said, and Ms. Murray may hit on some of those. And when she does I want you to think, what was Mr. Kumraju say to that? How would we the defense team respond? And if you do, I think you'll see that they still can't meet their burden. What else does Mr. Gua get on his side of the scale? Well, he gets us, his lawyers, and so here I am slugging away. And what else? Well, Mr. Finkel talked about it. He talked about how in this country, we have you. And that's specially true for Mr. Gua, because you are to be a jury of his peers, to determine his innocence. He gets you reviewing the evidence, looking at all the angles. He gets you using your common sense and asking does it make any sense. He gets you applying the critical eye to the government's proof that is required by law. And he gets you using your best judgment to decide this case. He gets you. And, ladies and gentlemen, I have to say, if you do all those things, apply the law that Judge Torres has given you to the facts that you've heard during this trial, there is only one verdict that you could reach that's consistent with justice, and that's that you send this man home. That you send him back to his family, that you send him back to his friends, that you send him back to his fight. Thank you.
The court said, "Members of the jury, we still have not finished all phases of the trial. Next is going to be the rebuttal by the prosecution. After that, I will be giving you more instructions on the law. Briefly, but at this time we're going to take a break of about 10 minutes. Remember that you're not allowed to discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't permit others to discuss it in your presence. Don't read, watch or listen to anything from any source that touches upon the subject matter of this trial."
The law clerk said, "Jury exiting."
Jury not present.
The court said, "Who will be delivering the rebuttal?"
Ms. Murray said, "I will, Your Honor."
The court said, "Please let me know when you're ready."
Ms. Murray said, "Thank you."
Recess.